By the 1810s, the Ndwandwe kingdom, led by Zwide, found itself surrounded by hostile states and subjected to structural forces that drove it to rationalize state institutions to levels hitherto unseen in the region. The influx of cloth, beads, and brass from Delagoa Bay had become important sources of patronage for ruling houses, and therefore the Mthethwa attempt to monopolize these goods threatened the hold any ruling house would have over its adherents. As I've also mentioned before, at the same time this happened, the pattern of trade in the bay was transformed by the increasing demand for cattle by whalers revictualling after long voyages. The Mthethwa, and to a lesser extent the Ndwandwe, would have supplied this demand, but because of the central role cattle played in these societies as a prestige good, trade good, dowry, ritual requirement, and really the central commodity, the incentives would have increased for them to extract more cattle by way of tribute from their own adherents and to raid cattle from weaker neighboring chiefdoms. There are historians who insist on including the added factor of slaving as a force that led to Zwide's conduct. After carefully going through the literature and considering the question, I do not put much stock in this myself, particularly as it relates to Zwide. Slaving doesn't really become a major factor in Delagoa Bay until you get to the early 1820s. And by that point, the most celebrated part of Zwide's career is over. If you are interested in this debate, read Julian Corbing's famous paper and Elizabeth Eldred's devastating analysis in response to it. Whatever the case may be, Zwide responded to these pressures by keeping the Ndwandwe on a permanent war footing, and unusually for the region, launching wars of annihilation, instead of the limited aim of seizing cattle and establishing weaker chieftaincies as tributaries. Zwide sought to completely destroy their ruling houses and to subjugate the populations. The most striking example of this policy was Zwide's attitude toward the budding Ngwane state. Under Ngwane III, the Dlaminis had been kicked out of the Makutu Hills to settle in Eshiselweni. There they were in close proximity to a Ndwandwe vassal, the Hlophe clan, led by a man named Digodvo. Under Ngwane's son, Ndvungunye, the Hlophe would come to be a Ngwane vassal. The Ngwane were further augmented by the Ndungwa Simelane who had fled from Zwide. When it became clear Zwide was planning to launch a war against the Ngwane, now led by Sobhuza I, proposed a marriage alliance with Zwide. Sobhuza would take Zwide's daughter as his great wife, the woman who would grow into the great Thandile Ndwandwe, Queen Mother, Queen Regent, and great founder of the Swazi state proper as I see it. But at the time she was simply a young maiden who hoped to establish peace between her husband's people and her father's people. Unfortunately, it was not meant to be. Zwide was uninterested in peace and had only been forced to hold off on war by the diplomatic legerdemain of a wily Sobhuza. Soon after Thandile and Sobhuza settled into the bliss of marriage, their tranquility was shattered by a dispute between Sobhuza and Zwide over grain fields just south of the Pongola. It was the casus belli Zwide had been looking for, and with it now in hand, he sought the total destruction of the Dlamini house. The Ndwandwe army crossed the Pongola and poured into the Eshiselweni region, the core of the Dlamini state. Sobhuza knew he could not stand against such a host. He retreated to Epungalekazi, which translates to the smell of blood, near what is Tlatikulu, with most of his adherents staying behind. Then further still to the rocky fortress of Buseleni, just north of the Mkonvo River, when Zwide continued to hunt him. Even this was not enough. The Ndwandwe war cries continued to dog him, so he had to retreat even further to the Ngabaneni stronghold of the Masegos on the far side of the Lusutfu River. Zwide was relentless. Sobhuza had to then retreat to the Ezulwini Valley, in which the royal capitals were to later stand, and then finally to the protection of a Soto chief named Makoboi living around the Lomolomo Mountains, somewhere further northwest. This would have been a harrowing experience, and at the end there he only had a few hundred followers. The embryo of Swazi history was in mortal danger. This is a very teleological statement for me to make, but I can't help but experience reading that account as a deeply personal historical odyssey. Anyways, At this moment of greatest danger, it is as if Providence, having ordained the establishment of a Swazi state, intervened and shaped Zwide's sense of the growing danger of Mtetwa power, and surely he thought he would be able to return to finish the job. So he retreated down past the Pongola to set the southern part of his kingdom in order. This is because the southwestern and western fringes of his borders had seen the rapid growth of Mtetwa influence under Dingiswayo. To ameliorate this, Zwide attacked two Kumalo chieftaincies led by Donda and Mashobane, killing both chiefs and subjugating the people. Hot on the heels of this conquest, he used the Kumalo territory as a springboard to invade the neighboring Jali and Mlota, also meeting at the same treatment to chief and people. Fresh from 3 devastating wars, Zwide turned his army toward the Ngwane of Matiwane, not the Dlamini Ngwane of Swaziland. In early 1817, in the region of what is modern Vrihid, I hope that pronunciation is okay, the Ndwandwe drove the fleeing Ngwane from the land, seized their cattle, but were unable to kill the chief, Matiwane, who retreated with what remained of his adherents. Matiwane would go on to a career that was equally famous and renowned. Not content with this, Zwide resolved to bring more tightly under his control the chieftaincy in the easternmost part of his domain. This was the jealous section of the Ngwangeni under their chief, the now famous Zwangendaba. We are told this campaign miscarried and Zwide was captured. And staying true to the old norms and traditions, he was released by Zwangendaba, which in light of subsequent events would look foolish, but we have to understand that Zwangendaba and the other chiefs still adhered to the ancient and old norms of conduct. You would think this would have forced Zwide to slow down and reconsider. Well, you'd be wrong. His regiments were surely the most capable in the region at this point, and having largely secured himself from the north, he now sought to throw the full weight of his regiments against Dingiswayo. Reaching for a pretext, he settled on attacking the Ngumalo section of the Ndwandwe on his southeastern border. His cousin, Malusi, the leader of this clan, had married Dingiswayo's sister, perhaps as a hedge against the disturbing behavior of the main Ndwandwe line ruled over by Zwide. Well, Zwide was having none of it and almost certainly hoping to provoke Dingiswayo. He attacked the Ngumalo and had Malusi killed. Just as he almost surely predicted, this provoked Dingiswayo into declaring war on the Ndwandwe. In late 1817, the great hosts were a few hours from meeting. Dingiswayo had established himself as a great statesman and a good general. His armies had seen great warriors and generals like Shaka rise to the fore. But Shaka was no longer a member of that army. He was a chief in his own right. And Dingiswayo's conquests had become matters of superlative politicking more than great generalship at this point. Zwide as a general was at the height of his power. He had stumbled against the jailer because of his great paranoia, but his army remained faultless. Regiment upon regiment, each of them had proved their excellence. With their distinctive name and regalia, they stood ready to do battle with the Mtetwa, the Ulovunga, Iziboya, Amangaiya, Abahlakabe, and many famous and battle-hardened regiments. Yet, in the end, it was the great cunning of their king that proved decisive. We are told Dingiswayo was lured out of his camp to survey the battlefield, and the Ndwandwe, having laid an ambush, were able to spirit him away to their camp. Unlike Zwangendaba's treatment of Zwide, Dingiswayo was killed, and afterwards given all the funeral rites of a great chief. Such, then, is the unfortunate end of so great a man. With their chief killed, the Mtetwa host was swept from the field and retreated in a disorderly fashion. As things stood, for a glittering moment, Zwide was the hegemon east of the Drakensberg. His next move was to establish his dominance over the territories south of the White Mfolozi, which had previously been dominated by the Mtetwa. Standing in his way was Shaka of the Zulu, who had been encouraged by Dingiswayo to expand and militarize as a way to stabilize what at the time were the western boundaries of an expanding Mtetwa kingdom. Throughout 1819 and 1820, Zwide launched 3 wars against the Zulu, aimed at destroying this final nuisance. But in Shaka he had met his match. The first Ndwandwe campaign was frustrated by the scorched earth policy followed by the Zulus. They destroyed their grain and retreated with their cattle into the broken and heavily forested Ngandla region, starving out the invaders who had to retreat. Shaka would use these moments of respite to bring the southern chieftaincies under his control, either through persuasion or, as the Cwabe soon discovered, by force. The third and final showdown saw Shaka marshal all of his troops and meet the Ndwandwe along the Mhlatuze River. The Zuluist account of this is that the result was a great and resounding Zulu victory, with Zwide escaping by the skin of his teeth. We are told this victory broke the cohesion of the Ndwandwe, with various sections of the kingdom fleeing Shaka. However, the emerging revisionist account, which frankly I find more credible, that the defeat finally allowed the internal discontent with Zwide to emerge, and that the Ndwandwe strands left to assert their independence under respective chiefs, makes more sense to me. Let us remember, Zwide had killed Mzilikazi's father, Mashobane, and now the Khumalo under Mzilikazi could leave. Zwangendaba of the Ngwangeni Jele also fled, as did Soshangane of the Ngumalo and Ngaba of the Msane. All of them were Ndwandwe vassals who had to deal with the overbearing yoke imposed on them by Zwide. In the popular imagination, this is when Zwide's story usually ends. But we know he went on to build a formidable kingdom. Although the record of his travel is sparse, I want to briefly sketch out what seems to be the most probable account of his life after the battle. Zwide seems to have crossed the Pongola to seize Swazi cattle, where he was properly bloodied by Sopuza's Mamba lieutenants. Not wanting to be too close to Shaka, he proceeded northwest and settled in the Upper Ngomati region. From here, he was able to reconstitute his kingdom, dominating a region that extended from the Olifants River in the north to the Pongola River in the south. He raided the Pedi, the Dlamini, and other polities that had accumulated significant holdings of cattle. In fact, this new Ndwandwe estate continued to worry Shaka, although Zwide also made sure to stay clear of that great Zulu captain. To the southwest of this new Ndwandwe estate, Mzilikazi Mashobane of the Khumalo was setting up a similar state. However, Mzilikazi's state could never have really flourished with the Ndwandwe so close. After all, the Ndwandwe considered them vassals, even though they had abandoned Zwide. For me, this is simply an interesting point of history. Anyway, in late 1824 or early 1825, Zwide Galanga, great chief of the Ndwandwe, finally died. He had only had 2 serious potential heirs, Sikunyana and Somapunga. In the end, it was Sikunyana that won out, with Somapunga and his adherents joining and pledging allegiance to Shaka. Shaka, on seeing the weakness of the Ndwandwe royal house, and because a number of British traders in Port Natal in his domain with black staff members carrying firearms were present, decided to act. In the middle of 1826, Shaka summoned the traders to support him in an expedition against the Ndwandwe, and in August or September of that year, he accompanied his army in an invasion of Ndwandwe territory from the southeast. The civilians left their crops and their fields standing, driving their livestock before them as they fled. From the north, Sikunyana and his forces advanced to Izindololwane hills north of the Upper Pongola, and here the two armies met in a fierce battle. The Ndwandwe forces were defeated, and what women and children had accompanied them were massacred. Determined to annihilate the Ndwandwe polity for good, Shaka destroyed all the homesteads and grain. The Ndwandwe people were forever scattered. Some would be absorbed by Shaka, others by Sopuza, and a few by Soshangane of the Ngumalo and by Mzilikazi of the Ndebele. Sikunyana escaped, but his people had been so thoroughly defeated that he simply disappeared from history. Thus ends the story of Zwide and the Ndwandwe.